So I used to walk around the farmland that I live on for exercise. My sleep schedule was pretty messed up for a while, and I slept during the day, so I decided to walk at night. But nothing around but the coyotes and the occasional weirdo, which, by the way, I'm not saying that I'm not a part of that group. So I get about 40% of the way through the mile walk when I see something heading towards the crossroads in front of me. It's just a shadow under the moonlight, which is weird considering it was a full moon, but from my 6'2" perspective, it was taller than the almond orchard tree line, so it must have been at least 9 feet tall. And at this point, I'm pretty terrified to say the least, and I'm kind of developing a primal fear, and despite actually carrying a weapon at the time, I turned my headlamp off and I run nearly half a mile back to my house, feeling like I was being chased the whole way there. Once I get back to the lights of my house, I instantly feel safer, and I stand around watching the darkness for a while, but there's nothing. So I go back in and I relay the story to my family. The next night I go back out again and I see the biggest and most unnatural print ever on the same road that I was running. And here's an actual picture of the print. Now, this is definitely not a bear. It's not a mountain lion either, and none of those even make sense for my area. Beyond that, my boot size is 11 wide as well. The coyote prints are usually 2.5 inches wide at most. This print is nearly 5 inches wide. I've been told Dogman by 5 different people now, but I'm just an absolute skeptic. Whatever it was, though, it was big, and it definitely was on the path that I was on. I lived in Sydney as a child, not hustling and bustling in a city, but kind of southwest in what you would call a more family-based environment. Close enough that my dad could commute fairly easily considering the traffic in peak hours, but far enough that my mum still felt safe when she was home alone with us of the day. Sydney City is pretty dodgy, and normally only those who can have cash to splash can consider themselves properly safe. Anyway, this was in the early 2000s. Nothing as sophisticated as widespread and easy-to-access video feed doorbells, and once again, only those well-off have the monitoring systems at this point. Now, my family was young. My parents were mainly considered too young to have 2 young kids and hard-working to provide for us. We lived in a 2-bedroom unit or apartment that, for the most part of my early memories, was pretty amazing. We had plenty of friends in the neighborhood that parents would set playdates with us, and it was a nice area, but at night, as I've since learned, you can never be too sure of anything. Growing up, I was always an inquisitive kid. My older brother, even with the extremely small age gap between us, was leaps and bounds ahead of me, though. He would be what you'd call a classically book-smart kind of kid. I love him a lot, but the fella just does not have common sense or street smarts whatsoever. Even then, I remember my mother worrying about him. And so I was always very protective of him because, although he was older, he was smaller in a way. My mum never worried about me. I was always down to make a scene if something was wrong and very heavily relied on my gut instincts, which she knew about me. My brother had really bad asthma as well, and when my mum and dad got bunk beds, I didn't care too much about an occasional cough from him in the night, but as we continued to sleep like that, me on the bottom bunk because I was clumsy, I began to become more aware of his coughing at night and the fact that he needed his inhaler and whatnot. I would get it for him and just sit on his bed until he felt better. And so, it would wake me up some nights, like this one in particular. So, it was a pretty usual night, nothing to double take at. My parents were in bed and it must have been around 1:30 in the morning, I think, when my brother just started coughing. It woke me up instantly and I was aware of what I had to do to help him out, run-of-the-mill night kind of thing. Except this time when I went to roll over, I stopped myself. There was someone in the room. Figuring my dad had heard him, I simply looked up at the bottom of the mattress and asked, "Did I miss the coughing this time, Dad?" And there was no answer. And instead, a figure in all black slowly bent down and signaled to me to shush as he stood back up. I got out of bed and just kind of looked at him, and he was standing bolt upright, but his head was cocked to the side as if it was a fascinating thing, that my brother was coughing his guts out. My eyes fixed on him the whole time, just shifting the tilt of his head every now and then. I got a gut feeling that this wasn't normal or safe, and the dread finally washed over me, and I screamed for my dad. The man didn't even break his stare and just stood there until my dad rushed in with a bat. He gave one more glance at me, and then he just took off, weaseled past my dad, who couldn't get the angle to swing, and he just bolted. My dad took off almost in step with the creep, and I kind of adrenaline blurred the next bit from my junior memory, but my next memory is watching my dad walk back up the street dragging the bat. Apparently, he had chased him fueled with anger, but just missed when he swung at him. For the record, I vaguely remember that Dad wasn't very convincing, I'd say. I think he just said it to calm my mum and us down a bit, but he was really fit and quite a muscular guy too, and he probably got a couple of good ones in before it was over. Obviously, we went through the regular steps with policing and statements, but nothing ever really came of it, and we ended up just moving not long after that incident. So it's 1982, and Ronald Reagan is turning the US Navy from 400 ships to 800 ships because of the Soviet Union. The Navy takes a lot of old ships they mothballed in Bremerton, Washington, and tow them over to Tacoma to refurbish them and bring them back into service. I'm pretty sure they did this everywhere they had old Navy ships. So I get a job as the security guard with a company being contracted with Tacoma Bow to have a huge contract with the US Navy. I can't remember the name of the ship, but it was an electronic warfare ship, which means that I have no idea what it was for. Probably a spy ship that listened into Soviet ships and submarines or something, but I'm just guessing. So, I was not in the Navy. I was a civilian security guard with a total of 8 hours of security guard training under my belt, assigned to walk the entire freaking ship every couple of hours. It was me and another guy, and the other guy was honestly crazier than a squirrel on meth, but hey, when you're paying your guards $3.15 per hour, you can take what you can get. We took turns walking the ship, as we called it, and had to go all over the ship to make sure nobody was there. The workers go there at 6 a.m. and left by 7 p.m, lots of overtime because Ronnie wanted his 600 ships fast. Lots of expensive tools lying around, as well as paintbrushes, paint guns, and not the toys but the actual sprayers, sanders, all sorts of things that one could sell if you ripped them off, so that's what we were for. Now, nobody was supposed to be on the ship at all, but me and the hyperactive mental fellow security guard, we took turns. I would walk the ship 1 hour, and then he would walk the ship next, and then me next, until our shift was over at 6 a.m. The ship appeared to be pretty much gutted of just about all of its electronic equipment. I was told that all the equipment was being replaced with new equipment, but they had to paint it all inside and out first, and they were still in the painting phase. Also, they were also working on the engines below or something, hence all the tools that I saw in the engine room. So, I worked there for maybe 5 days at most, I think. Maybe not even that even, and it was a long time ago. But I would always hear these voices. I'd be in one room and the voices would come from the corridor. I'd be in the corridor and the voices would come from a room. Just the voices of men like they were talking to each other or something. Obviously, I would go into the corridor when I heard the voices, thinking that somebody had broken in or something, and then I'd see nobody and hear nothing. But then voices would come from a certain room and I'd rush in there and again, nobody there, and just silence. I concluded that there were radios on the ship or something at the time, and some kind of PA system that I was not familiar with. I told the other guard about the voices, and he said, "Man, that's effing wild. I mean, I don't know what it is." He was either crazy or high, and I couldn't tell which, and I asked if he was playing a joke on me, and he laughed and denied it. I still wasn't convinced or sure though, because he looked pretty crazy, and this was long before drug testing. But the last night I was there, it was the same thing, just the voices all over the place. One of the mechanics who worked on the engine came in early, about 5 p.m, and was sipping on coffee in our guardroom, a part of a trailer, and he actually said, "I'm hearing those voices again all over the ship. It must be some kind of radio." And the mechanic swallowed hard and shook his head no back and forth and said, "No, there's no radios on this ship anymore. They gutted the whole thing and took them all out. They're going to install new ones, but they're not here yet." And to be quite honest, I was stunned. I remember saying to the guy, in fact, "Are you sure?" And he took another sip of coffee and nodded yes. And after that day, I just never went back. And today, I regret not going back, because I would have loved to have found out more and maybe even tried to communicate with these things. So this happened to me around my freshman year of high school in 2011. I was around 13 or 14 years old at the time, and my sister was 4 school grades younger than me. Every day I would come home on the bus, arriving at my house at around 2:20 p.m. or so, and it was about a 10 or maybe 15-minute ride from the high school to my house. I lived in the countryside, so my stop was a ways away from the other neighborhoods that kids lived in. My house was directly next to a farm, and we only had a few neighbors, all older folk who stuck to themselves pretty much. Due to living in a rural area and having an extremely long dirt driveway, when I got home from school, I had to walk a few minutes down the driveway before I got to the back slider door. I would enter my house, lock the door behind me, and put my things down, and every day it was the same routine when I got home. I would check on my dog's food and water and watch TV in the living room for a little while. Now, my living room window has a perfect view of the front yard of my house, as well as the driveway and where the bus would stop at the end of our driveway too. And here's where things started to get interesting. So, while I would watch TV in the living room, I would keep an eye out of the window to watch for my sister to arrive home from middle school and make sure that she got off the bus and up the driveway safely. She would get out of school around 2:30 and arrive at my house closer to 3 p.m, and I would keep the door locked until I knew that she'd be home in a few minutes, and then I'd unlock it so that she could get into the house when she gets into the back door. I did that same thing this day, just like every other day, and while in the living room, I saw my sister's bus pull up to the end of the driveway, stop, and I watched her get off the bus. I remember she was wearing a North Face jacket, a scarf, and she had a fairly large teal backpack on, jeans and boots. She was walking up the driveway and went out of my view, and I heard the back slider door open, close, and lock as she came into the house. From where I was sitting in the living room, I could see her walk past a doorway down the hallway to her room, and I yelled out her name and asked her how school was, but I didn't get an answer. I got up to follow her and repeat my question because I thought she didn't hear me, and as I walked into the hallway, the very same hallway that I'd just seen her walk down, I noticed that there were no lights on. The hallway was dark, and her room at the end of the hallway was also dark. I said her name again, and I didn't hear anything. I turned the light on and went into her room, and she wasn't there either. I figured that maybe she went into another room in the house, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I went back out to check the back door, and to my surprise, it was still unlocked and slightly open, which didn't make any sense because I just heard my sister close and lock the door when she got home. Confused, I closed the door and locked it and went back to the living room to grab my phone, and as I entered the room, the strangest thing happened. Out of the window, I saw my sister's bus pull up, stop, and I watched her get off the bus and walk up my driveway again. When she came in the house, I told her the weirdest thing just happened, and I saw you get off the bus and come inside and lock the door, but you weren't anywhere in the house, and then I looked outside and saw you get off the bus again, and when I checked the door, it was unlocked and opened, and she responded saying, "That's really weird, because the door was unlocked when I came inside, and you usually leave it open for me." I explained how I locked it because I thought that she was in the house, and I thought it was really strange that the door was open and unlocked without either of us manipulating it. Might I add, too, that my sister was wearing a t-shirt, scarf, leggings, and boots, but a totally different outfit than I saw the first time. I didn't know what I was seeing or what just happened, and I've had paranormal experiences in the past, stories that I'd be happy to share, but this one was weird, and it really takes the cake. At the time, I didn't know if this was some kind of entity mimicking my sister and trying to get my attention, or if this was some kind of a glitch in reality or something. But I would love to hear some theories and stories that are similar to mine, if you guys don't mind sharing in the comments. So my parents told me this story some years ago, but I'd forgotten about it until, well, recently. So, to put some context to this, I was born via C-section in a fairly decent hospital, which, at the time, lacked a supervised parking lot, having instead an open parking space whose sole guards were a group of people that would often clean the cars for a fee. Not that the C-section was bad, but my mum had to stay some days in the hospital after I was born because she got sick, and I must say that my dad has yet to this day to forgive any of my mother's family for barely showing up to either visit or care for her as well. He never left us alone, as it was sadly very common back then to have kids snatched away by either medical staff or just random strangers. Not that it no longer happens, but it was just rampant back then. Now, by the time my mum and I were given the green light to go, my dad walked her to the parking lot and my mum was holding me in the blankets and everything was going normal. Save for the fact that it was getting pretty dark, but suddenly they noticed a man approaching them, one hand inside of his jacket. The guy was walking towards them at a seemingly slow pace, but my parents knew right away that there was something off about this dude. My mum was obviously in no condition to run, and my dad refused to leave her behind should this guy attack, but they silently decided that it would be best if my mum let my dad run away with me if the situation arose. As they were still somewhat separated from the guy, my dad pushed my mum into another direction, trying to go back into the hospital until this guy in a raspy voice said, "You've got a pretty baby girl in your arms. May I see her?" This raised all the alarm bells in both of my parents, and they said that they had a feeling that they were done for. I was covered from head to toe in at least 2 layers of thick blankets, and only my mum could see my face, and they even hadn't talked to the man, so that meant that he must have been following my parents from inside the hospital to know that I was a girl. But they had little time to react as the guy started approaching at a fast pace, and they knew that they wouldn't make it back to the hospital on time. No other person was seemingly around the area to help, and they thought that they were done for, at least until one of the guards came rushing into their aid, screaming at the creep. And the dude was old, but still had strength to beat this weirdo, and what's better, the ruckus begins to attract other guards who shielded my parents and forced the creep to run away, chasing him even until he was nowhere near the hospital. It turns out that the guard had seen this person from a distance, but it wasn't until he spotted my parents that he realized what was going on. My parents are forever grateful for the interference of those men who not only saved them from being potentially killed, but also saved me from being either sold to another family illegally or other shady business that I don't want to even think about. Since I was a kid, around 12 I think, I've always seen these dark, shadowy movements in my peripherals when walking around my house, watching TV, or anything else. I used to think it was just my imagination, as I was self-aware that I was only young and my mind could be making this up. Seeing these movements, though, stopped when I was around 15, but came back as I turned 17. I'm 18 in a few months, and some other stuff has happened since then. I should also say, too, that I haven't ever seen anything like this anywhere else or been afraid like this in other people's houses. I should also disclose that my house is exactly 100 years old this year, and I even found an old World War I helmet in the garden, and I don't know if that has anything to do with this, but I think it might. Anyway, since the shadowy movements have come back, a few things have happened. So one day, as I was getting into bed, I heard a female voice say my name. I thought it was my mum, but she had gone to bed hours earlier, so I replied with something along the lines of, "Yeah, what do you need?" and I got no reply. I didn't think too much of it, though, and I just kind of shrugged it off, and then I heard my name again seconds after, but this time I was too afraid to answer. That night too, I couldn't sleep, so I just laid in bed thinking about what happened, and this is when I heard my bag start to move. I know it was my bag too, as it was the only thing near my bed at the time. And the noise I'm talking about is like the shuffling noise as something is being dragged across a carpet, although the dragging noise was very gradual. After a while it stopped, but obviously I didn't get any sleep that night. Months have passed since that happened, and since then I don't think too much of it, but I remember thinking at the time that there was 100% something else in my room. Now, the second thing was I was home alone playing a game on my PS4, and I actually heard my sister walk up the stairs and into her room and walking up the stairs for a minute or two. I also could hear her muffled voice of her talking to someone on the phone or something, and I should point out too that I actually saw her in the corner of my eye as the living room door is slightly visible from where I was sitting and has a large glass pane in it. And about an hour later, my dad got back home and told me that he was going to pick up my sister from work. I didn't tell him or anyone that I thought I had seen my sister walk up the stairs, but that has definitely made me feel different about the house. For several weeks last year, I was asked to cover and supervise a warehouse team on an evening shift working until midnight. One of my duties was to check the whole warehouse at the end of the shift for security and health and safety reasons, ensuring that everything was good for the morning shift, who started at 7 a.m. Now, I'm not really one for measurement and couldn't tell you the exact size of the warehouse, but think of a large supermarket over 3 floors and that will give you a pretty good idea of how large the place is. One night I was running late in the warehouse alone at around 0:45 a.m. on the top floor, and the top floor was laid out in a long narrow picking aisle, much like a supermarket, with a small packing area where I was stood collecting paperwork. All the aisles were in complete darkness as the lights were powered by movement. The only lit area was the packing bench where I was stood. I was standing square on to one of the aisles and could see down to the very far end of the top floor from where I was. I just finished my paperwork when I heard a click and the light at the very far end of the aisle came on. I knew it was the one at the very end as it illuminated the door and wall. I looked quite surprised because I knew that there was nobody else in there because they had all gone home about 45 minutes before. I mean, I'd watched them all leave. Seconds later, a click again and the next light came on. Then the third light a few seconds after, and by this point, I'm starting to get pretty scared as one by one, the aisles begin to just light up section by section as if something or someone was walking directly towards me. But the hairs on the back of my neck stuck up and I was frozen as the whole aisle just clicked and lit up till it eventually reached the end of the aisles, just feet from where I stood. I looked around pretty carefully and I can assure you that there was nothing there that could cause these lights. No rodents, no animals, no cockroaches, nothing. And it's safe to say that I never stayed that late again in the warehouse on my own, and it did freak me out. I told a few of my colleagues too, but none of them believed me. So this happened last night as I was coming home from work. I'm a 23-year-old woman and I don't have a driver's license, so I take public transport or Uber a lot. I've had several people give me general bad vibes and make me feel a little bit unsafe, but this is the first time somebody has crossed the line from creepy to scary with me on my commute. I stayed a little later than usual at work yesterday because, well, I'm trying to learn After Effects and I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the practice project I'd going on. I left the office around 5:45 and walked 10 minutes to the bus stop. The sun was going down, but there was still light in the sky, so it wasn't too dark yet. I didn't have to wait long, too, for the bus, and the driver pulled up and was very friendly as he scanned my ticket, which is on my phone. I took one of the seats that faces the inside aisle, which I prefer not to do, but it was the only place to sit where I didn't have to sit directly next to somebody who was already on the bus. because, I value personal space and all that. After a few stops, we made a stop near the major university in my city, and a young guy got on, probably younger than me, but not by much, and unfortunately sat directly next to me. He smelled bad, but not as bad as some people I've encountered on the bus, so I didn't think to move or anything, and right away he made a sound like, huh, and I thought that he was going to comment on the music in my headphones, but he didn't. He just looked at my phone. He said, "Are you on Facebook?" I said, "No, I'm on Twitter." He said, "Never understood it. You ever sold anything on Facebook?" I said no, and he kept asking me just really weird questions like that. Like he just wanted to talk to me, and he didn't care about what it was. At this point, I figured he was just trying to flirt and was just bad at it, so I politely answered his questions and tried not to be too friendly about it. He asked if I was a student. I'm not, and whether I would rather live in a mansion or an apartment. Obviously a mansion, I said, and he said his goal was to have a house big enough to put a skate park in it. I said, "That's a good goal," thinking that this guy was probably not playing with a full deck, but not wanting to be a jerk about it either. He said, "You're awesome," and he asked me, "Are you looking for a best friend?" I said no, that I have a best friend and we've known each other since I was about 8 years old. And then, like it was so casual, he said to me, "If you tell me where he lives, I could kill him." I honestly didn't know what to say to this. I looked around for someone on the bus to intervene, but nobody had heard what he said, so I just said, "Probably not." Then he kind of laughed in a really weird way and said, "You smell good." At this point, I just put my headphones back on and just tried to tune him out. There were no available seats for a couple of stops, so I just had to sit there with him talking in my ear as well. Obviously, I couldn't hear him. I was listening to Pedro Fernandez as loud as I could, and as soon as a seat was opened, I moved away from him to a forward-facing seat and put my purse next to me in a defensive position. I started to get worried about whether this guy would get off the bus before I did, though, and my destination was pretty far down the line, but I didn't need him following me home or even know where I usually get off the bus, right? I mean, what would have stopped him from waiting there for me? So I texted my roommate to pick me up at the Hooters halfway home. And right as I did this, thankfully he got off downtown, and lucky for me because my roommate was busy and couldn't actually pick me up. Also, just for the record, my childhood best friend is a girl, but I wasn't about to tell him that though.